Welcome to the Crackdown Show. I'm your host, Dr. G, with a PhD. Before we get started, remember guys, tell your friends about this show, and please like and subscribe on this episode. It really helps with the YouTube algorithms. If you like the thumbnail art, you can check it out on a much higher resolution on Instagram. And remember, leave any questions you might have throughout the week. And on the last episode of the week, I will be answering the questions in a mailbag. So on today's episode, I actually forgot to do mailbag last week, so I'm going to start with mailbag this week. And we're going to do about 10 to 11 minutes of mailbag. So that's just going to answer you guys' questions. They're really interesting this week, and I hope you guys get a lot out of it. And I love mailbag. So if you guys want to keep asking questions, keep interacting, I think that's the best part of the show. So please keep doing so. We'll start off with mailbag. Then we're going to go into some news around the world, just updates on Canada, France, and New Zealand. And, mostly promising stuff, but these governments are doing some pretty weird things. We'll tell you guys about that. And finally, we'll do a report on stocks from Pfizer and stocks from Moderna and what the Moderna CEO is doing. And it's all kind of funky with the timing. So with that, let's dive on in. So let's do some mailbag. Our first question comes from D Money, and here it is. I have started to notice this same argument from both sides when it comes to protests, BLM, Jan 6, etc. One side focuses on the crimes committed and call it a violent protest, while the other says that it's just a few bad people and doesn't represent the movement as a whole. How can we determine if a protest is violent or peaceful in a way that is fair and accurate? Could we base it on crimes committed per capita? Should the motivation behind the protest be considered? So thanks for the question, D Money, and thank you so much for listening. I'll take them in reverse order. So should the motivation behind the protest be considered? Motivations are important for understanding protests, definitely. Why are they protesting? That's great in terms of, coming to a reasonable conclusion or discussing, or, even in general, you want to steelman your opponent. You want to know exactly the reason why they're doing what they're doing. That way you can come up with the best plan to mitigate the worst outcome. That being said, I don't think the motivation behind the protest should be considered in terms of a violent act or a criminal act. So for example, you could be protesting for the best cause, but if you're hurting innocent people, just because your cause is good doesn't make the hurting innocent people good. So those are two separate things, and they should be treated as such. And that's why I always emphasize the individual needing to be punished for the crimes they commit. So in terms of the peaceful versus violent protest and how to tell in a way that's fair and accurate, that's actually a way harder question to answer than it sounds. So on its surface, it's one of those things where it's like, if you see it, you know it. If it's peaceful, it's peaceful. If it's violent, it's violent. But for me, I think there needs to be some distinctions drawn. I like to be clear in my definitions as much as possible. And so if I'm looking at a protest and everyone's yelling, I don't consider that to be particularly violent, or honking their horns. I don't consider that to be particularly violent. But if you listen to some of these lawmakers discussing, for example, the Freedom Convoy, they're calling this pretty violent actions, insurrections, So for me, I think I would draw the line on people getting injured or property getting injured. If a big group of people is marching down a street and all they're doing is yelling and marching, I think that would be generally considered peaceful. If a big group of people is going down the street and houses are getting destroyed or stores are getting looted or people are getting hurt physically, I think that tends to be more violent. And you can see that. And now, again, in all those cases, the individuals committing the violence are the ones that need to be charged, right? And they're the ones that ruin it ultimately for the movement. That's the main reason why I think this trucker movement has been so successful, is that in terms of crimes committed, it's been zero as far as I can tell. And then the middle question is, could we base, so this is in relation to the first question, could we base it on crimes committed per capita? I think that's a great comparison tool in general. So you can do that in two ways. One, you could do that to compare to different cities. So you could do Chicago versus Houston versus LA versus New York. And by using a per capita number, then you can make them a little more comparable. But you could also use that per capita number within the city. So you could say, what's the per capita number of crimes happening on Tuesday, January 12th? And then you can look at that same number in March 6th, for example, and you can compare those two per capita numbers to see if crime locally has gone up or down. And I think that's a great metric, initially at least, for figuring out what crime is doing. That doesn't necessarily solve what you should do about it, because it doesn't say why crime is increasing or decreasing, but it gives you a starting place. Again, thank you so much, D-Money, for the question. I look forward to many, many more. Let's go to another question. Next up, this is an older question, so it's been a little bit. This was from an episode back in January. And here's the question, or here's the comment, then the question. Your episodes are superb, and I love how you fit so much important content with references in an easily digestible and very entertaining manner. Excellent section on potential effects of the vaccine and menstrual cycles in this episode. This really needs more public mentioning, as any small change in the menstrual cycle is no trivial matter. I do have a question for the mailbag. When people go to receive their COVID vaccine, they must document their acknowledgement on the screening form that they consent and are aware of the risks and benefits of the vaccine. How can they truly consent when there's lacking data on long-term effects of the vaccine? Doesn't that information asymmetry break the rules of true consent from the patient? Thank you very much for the question, and thank you so much for listening. So I know very little about law, I'm going to be honest with you guys, but I have a couple of resources here, and we can talk about my thoughts on this subject because I think it's very interesting. I think it's a really valid question. So first, I'm going to cite some things from a book called Pharmacy Practice and the Law, and this is the 8th edition. Now, the section I'll be taking material from is on the developing drugs section. And so this is going to be for getting consent on studies to determine different qualities of drugs. And in this case, they call it an IND, which is an investigational new drug application. So according to this textbook, the law requires a sponsor seeking an IND application to submit a substantial amount of information, including the name of the drug, its composition, methods of manufacture and quality control, information from preclinical, which are animal investigations regarding pharmacological, pharmacokinetic, and toxicological evaluations. So this is important. So there's two things going on here. One, we're developing a new drug, and we need to know basic things about it. So basically, we can't just throw things together in a lab and give it to someone straight out. What this process is trying to say is, look, there needs to be some evidence for why you might even want to try it in humans. And if you're going to try it in humans, you need to know some safety factors. We can't just be trying random things on people. That's what this section is talking about. Now, it should be understood that when you're trying a new drug, you are limited in your information, right? That's why you're doing these trials. That's why you're applying it. You've hopefully done quite a bit of studies on the back end in all these different animal models to sort of predict the safety value and then go to humans. All right, so now they break down basically phase 1, 2, and 3 in like very short paragraphs. And I think this is really informational, so I'm just going to read this little section to you guys. So if the FDA does not reject the IND request within 30 days of submission, human clinical testing may begin. The testing proceeds through 3 phases. Phase 1, which involves a small number of subjects. Usually these subjects are very, very healthy and in peak physical condition. That way if something goes wrong, they have the best chance at getting them healthy again. And so the investigators examine here the drug's toxicity, metabolism, bioavailability, elimination, and other pharmacological actions. Doses of the drug in this stage are usually quite low, and then they're gradually increased. The purpose of phase 1 is to determine safety and detect any adverse effects, not to determine the efficacy of the drug. If the drug passes phase 1 and it moves to phase 2, where it is tested on a limited number of patients who actually have the disease for which the drug is an intended treatment. The purpose of phase 2 is to determine the efficacy of the drug and the dosages at which the efficacy can occur. Investigators also continue to conduct pharmacological testing to further determine the drug's safety. If the drug's safety and efficacy appear promising, the study proceeds to phase 3, where the drug is tested for safety and efficacy in hundreds or even thousands of patients. These tests often occur in actual clinical settings, such as physician offices and hospitals that have contracted with the manufacturer to conduct the studies. Usually the studies are double-blind and compared with a control group that receives the placebo. This is all good lab practice, and this is going to give you the best kind of paper, these randomized control trials. And this last section of this paragraph is really important, and it says basically the FDA can terminate the testing of an IND at any time if the study shows that the drug is too toxic under the agency's benefit-risk ratio criteria. The FDA's determination is final and not subject to appeal or judicial review. If the phase 3 study results are favorable, the drug sponsor can submit an NDA to the FDA. Only about 1 in 10 drugs demonstrates enough merit to make it this far in the process. So in terms of informed consent, in all 3 IND clinical phases, the FDCA requires that investigators secure the informed consent of patients or a representative for the administration of an experimental drug. This requires that potential participants know the risks, possible benefits, and alternative course of treatments. All right, so that was all a brief summary of basically in a drug that's new or being developed, how we get the informed consent out there and what the 3 phases are, and this is from a pharmacy law book. So my thoughts on this when applying it to these vaccines, which is what your question is about, I have 2 thoughts on this. So one, the problem that I see when comparing the two is that the people are conflating the situation that these are approved by the FDA. So then this sort of drug development process doesn't really apply. The problem I have with that statement is that these were developed so quickly that you can't actually have all the data you would need that they need to give in these consent forms, right? You don't have the long-term data. You don't have all the outcomes. You don't have the fertility outcomes. Remember, they didn't test that. They didn't do the menstruation tests, if you remember from back when we talked about it in January. So we were missing a lot of data, and they approved the drug. Okay, so your question about the true consent, I think it's a good question because there can't possibly be true consent as defined here with all those criteria because we just don't know that enough about the drug yet. Now, the second thing is people are being offered consent forms. And so this is where it gets tricky because in general, you should kind of be able to consent to things you want to consent to within reason in the US, right? So what do I mean by that? If I go to a restaurant and they're trying a brand new food and it's kind of dangerous and it's never been cooked before, and the restaurant comes and brings out a consent form and says, hey, we've never ever cooked this. No one in the world has ever cooked this. We're going to cook it and you want to try it. You might get seriously injured or die. Do you consent? You could say yes or no. Or when you go skydiving, you consent, right? You can consent to dangerous things in the US. Now, the problem that I have in this particular instance is, again, it's conflating two things. It's conflating basically the new drug because it's a very, very new drug. It was developed in under a year. It's conflating a new drug with an approved drug by the FDA and asking for consent. So I don't actually know what's all in the full consent form, but I would imagine that, they have to say what they know and what they don't know. And I think it would be prudent for the hander-outers for the distributors of the vaccine to people, especially, the pharmacists, the doctors, the nurses, that are actually giving the people these shots, that they be familiar with the consent form and then ask the patient if they actually have any questions, make sure the patient knows what we don't know. Make sure the patient knows what we don't know in relation to other drugs that are in development that we do know a lot about, right? So for example, if there's been a drug and it's been in development for 10 years and now they're doing phase 2 trials, we know a lot about that drug. And we can tell the patient that's getting consent to be in that phase 2 trial a lot about that drug. It's much different than this particular drug, than the vaccines. So all that's taken into play. That's a really great question, and I wish I knew more about law, but I don't, so that's my limited scope. Please, if there are any lawyers out there, or any pharmacists that want to contribute to this conversation, please do. I think it's really interesting, and I think a lot of people can benefit. Thank you guys so much for those questions. All right, looking at stories from around the world, let's start with what we've always been starting with, at least for these past 2 weeks. Let's go to Canada. Let's hear what Trudeau has to say on February 11th in terms of police in Canada. Now, this is some pretty eerie stuff.
So make no mistake, the border cannot and will not remain closed. I want to remind everyone that politicians don't direct police in a democratic society, but I can assure you that the RCMP is working with provincial and local police departments to enforce the law. Everything is on the table because this unlawful activity has to end, and it will end. Of course, I can't say too much more now as to exactly when or how this ends because, unfortunately, we are concerned about violence.
Politicians don't direct the police in a democratic society. But when there's a but in a sentence like that, it is not going to be good on the other end, and it was not good on the other end. Unfortunately, they're concerned about violence, and by they, I mean Trudeau. And this is really interesting because still, as far as I've seen, there's been no criminal activity happening for the entirety of this 2-week-long protest. So what does this hand-in-glove police working with the government actually look like? Well, here's a short clip. So what you're seeing here this is the Ambassador Bridge between the US and Canada, or on the way to the Ambassador Bridge. And you see a bunch of police guys walking in police gear. You see some military personnel, and then you see a military or police vehicle. Looks pretty intense. As we discussed in the last episode, a bunch of convoys are happening all over the world, and France is showing a similar response to Canada, except they turned the notch up just one more bit. So here we have what appear to be a bunch of sort of APCs, like armored personnel carriers, outfitted to blockade the incoming convoy to Paris. That looks pretty terrifying, really intense. So the French police actually used tear gas to move some convoy people out of the way, and that actually spilled into some restaurants. So you can see here people kind of fleeing, getting out of the way of tear gas, which is just insane. So remember, these are, as far as we can tell, these are peaceful protests, and now their tear gas is coming out. Now again, for these protests to continue being successful, they have to remain peaceful. The second the protesters get particularly violent, the whole narrative is lost, and with that, all the things that the peaceful guys have been fighting for. With that being said, there are some pretty promising signs. Let's take a look at some New Zealanders performing a haka against vaccine mandates. Now, a haka is a very traditional sort of warrior dance, and this is a super cool video. Now, I only played about 20 seconds of that, but you can go see the full thing on the links in the description, and it is super cool, and that is a very traditional and awesome thing of the New Zealand culture. Now, before moving on to the rest of the news, here's the final thing I'm going to say about this. The truckers, the Freedom Convoy, these guys have already won. They've already won. They have to stay peaceful to continue progressing the agenda that they're progressing, but they've already won because they've shown how ineffective these leaders are, how political this whole thing has been. They're proving it day by day doing these things. And the unfortunate thing for these leaders is the truth always comes out. Reality always exerts itself, and it just happens again and again and again. And these truckers are in fact the reality. When I say that, I mean the data is behind what they're saying. The data is not behind these lockdowns. The data is not behind these mask mandates. The data is out on the vaccine still for many things. And so these truckers are the actual prudential ones in this situation. And that's what's biting these leaders in the butt, and it's going to continue doing so. I hope they remain peaceful, but in my eyes, they've already won, and I think in the world's eyes, they've won. So on to the big story of the day. We're going to talk about the Moderna and Pfizer stocks and what's going on there. So first up, Moderna's CEO has just dumped $400 million in stock and deleted his Twitter account. Oh boy, that's not good. According to this article, the CEO, which is Mr. Bancel, or Stefan Bancel, he sold a bunch of his shares, and you can see them here, how he sold them and the different price of the stocks. In total, it added up to almost $400 million. So this comes out days after Pfizer triggers a $28 billion stock plunge after warning that COVID vaccine sales may disappoint this year. So breaking down the Pfizer stocks, we're reading from Forbes. Despite skyrocketing revenue from the sale of COVID-19 vaccines, shares of Pfizer plunged Tuesday morning after the pharmaceutical giant issued worse than expected revenue guidance for this year, triggering a widespread plunge among vaccine stocks that have struggled to meet analysts' expectations as the pandemic begins to wane. So we'll just do the key facts and then return to Moderna. So key facts about the Pfizer stock. Pfizer shares fell more than 6% to $50 Tuesday morning, wiping out $19 billion in market value following an earnings report that beat analysts' expectations with $3.4 billion in a fourth quarter profit, which is up fourfold year over year, but then fell short of revenue projections, pulling in $23.8 billion compared to the average expectations calling for $24.1 billion. On Tuesday morning, in a Tuesday morning email, analyst Adam Crisafulli of Vital Knowledge Media pointed out that underwhelming report also issued a worse than expected guidance for sales of COVID-19 vaccines, which made up 53% of the firm's fourth quarter revenue, with Pfizer now calling for $52 billion in revenue from the shots this year compared to expectations of $58 billion. Other COVID vaccine makers also fell sharply after the report, with shares of Pfizer's partner BioNTech and competitor Moderna, which itself has struggled from disappointing projections, plunging 9% and 7% respectively, erasing nearly $9 billion in combined market value. Despite this plunge, the Pfizer CEO Adam Bourla praised the firm's watershed results during a Tuesday morning earnings call and pointed out expected overall revenue of about $100 billion next year would be a record high for the 173-year-old company. Bourla also placed emphasis on Pfizer's growing business outside of COVID-19 vaccines, touting a record high 13 clinical studies for new drugs last year and research and development investments that swelled from $8.9 billion to $10.5 billion. So what might you say could have caused the stocks to start falling? Well, let's take a look at Pfizer and the FDA's history real quick. Well, when I say history, I mean recent history, so in the last 2 months. So this article coming from January 7th. A judge scrapped the 75-year FDA timeline for releasing Pfizer's vaccine safety data, giving the agency 8 months. So originally, the Food and Drug Administration wanted a 75-year window to release thousands of pages of documents that it relied on to license the COVID-19 vaccine. Basically, it had to go from EUA, which is emergency use authorization, to fully approved. The federal agency now has just over 8 months to do so, per federal judge's ruling. So the original proceedings, how it was going to take 75 years for this, was that they were supposed to produce 500 pages a month, and that was the FDA's proposed timeline. So they were going to leak out or slow drip 500 pages of the study per month to the public over the course of 75 years. Then we could see all of the data that they took to make the decision to approve this drug. So 75 years, they approved it in a few months. So this is really suspect. So Pittman, the judge, ordered the agency to turn over 55,000 a month instead of 500, and that puts us in the ballpark of getting it in 8 months instead of 75 years. So this ruling for an expedited pace of more than 12,000 pages before January 31st, the timeline now is set. So January 31st already passed, so they had 12,000 pages in. So now the judge ordered the agency to produce the remaining documents at 55,000 pages every 30 days, with its first production begin being due March 1st, 2022. So now, hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have a lot more information on what's going on and how they approve this drug. Again, that's not necessarily safety data. For example, that's not like they're hiding they might be, I don't know, but it's not that they're going to have all the data. They're not going to have all the fertility data in these papers. What they're going to have is what the FDA used to make their decision. Because remember, this is a very young, new drug. So this is great stuff. And maybe it's coincidence that this just happened and the stocks are falling. Maybe the pandemic is really waning quite a bit and they're predicting less vaccines are going to come out, although that's weird because they're producing a new vaccine for Omicron. So something's fishy, and we're here for it, and we're going to keep investigating, and we'll keep you guys up to date with everything we find. And one last note on Moderna, and this tweet was released by Moderna on February 9th. And remember, just 2 days later, the CEO ended his Twitter and had already sold $400 million worth of stock. But in this tweet, Moderna says that, what if mRNA could treat life-threatening cardiovascular diseases such as heart failure? We're collaborating with AstraZeneca on an mRNA therapeutic that encodes for VEGF-A to promote recovery of cardiac function through tissue regeneration. And then has a picture, shows Moderna's mRNA encoding for VEGF-A, and then has an epicardial injection right into the heart, and then it says the protein it produces. So this is pretty interesting stuff, and I think on Tuesday or Thursday, I'll go over this really weird increase in heart attack commercials that I've noticed. But this is all interesting, and it's good to pay attention and good to stay on top of it. But that's all we have for you guys today. Thank you so much for listening. Please enjoy this video. Have a great start to your next week, and I'll catch you guys on Tuesday.